In the last episode of Rewriting History, we saw Richard Petty clinch his 4th championship in this timeline, and would also claim the last title of the Pioneer Era. So now with a modern era upon us, we are going to make some changes. In the original point system, I used the Latford system with a twist, maintaining the original format until 26, where instead of counting down by 3, we counted down by 2 until 54th, where we would count down by 1 all the way to 83rd, which just got 1 point. And we still had laps led points. So now with the modern era introducing things like shorter schedules, capped field sizes, more competitive cars, and a lot more, we have to change things. So now the change is in the points format. We will use the original Latford system introduced in 1975. Instead of counting down by 2 at 25th, we'll just count down by 3 all the way down to 54th. And anything past 54th will be 1 point, and we will still have laps led. So with that being said, let's take a look at the 1972 season with a consistent points format. In 1972, we will look at 5 drivers: James Hilton, defending champion Richard Petty, Bobby Allison, Benny Parsons, and Cecil Gordon. In the opening 6 races of 1972, we had 2 winners. Richard Petty would win the season opener at Riverside and then would win again 2 weeks later at Richmond. And Bobby Allison would win the 6th race of the season at Atlanta. So after 6 races, Richard Petty and Bobby Allison were only separated by 13 points, with Petty having the edge, with finishes of 1st, 26th, 1st, 4th, 2nd, and 6th. Through the next 6 races, these 2 drivers would swap the points lead 3 times, but ultimately Bobby Allison would have a 45th place finish at Talladega, and that would give Richard Petty the point lead after 12 races by just 85 points. At Dover, Bobby Allison would win while Petty finished 2nd, and the gap shrunk to 75 points. At Michigan, Allison finished 2nd while Petty finished 3rd, and the gap shrunk slightly to 70 points. At Riverside, Petty would dominate early and lead the most laps, but had an engine failure and finished 23rd, while Allison finished 6th and the gap shrunk all the way down to just 19 points. At the Texas World Speedway, Petty bounced back with a win while Allison finished 2nd, and the gap grew to 29 points. At Daytona, Petty finished 2nd and Allison finished 3rd, and the gap grew slightly to 34 points. At Bristol, the 2 drivers would fight for the win, leading 496 out of 500 laps, with Allison coming out on top. And now, with 13 races to go in the season, Petty and Allison were separated by just 24 points. And already, we had the closest championship battle in NASCAR history. At Trenton, Allison won the race while Petty finished 3rd, and the gap shrunk to 14 points. At Atlanta, Allison won his 3rd consecutive race and Petty finished 2nd, and now the gap was only 9 points. At Talladega, Allison finished 3rd and Petty finished 7th, and Allison would take the points lead by only 10 points over Petty. At Michigan, Allison finished 2nd while Petty finished 4th, and the gap grew to 20 points with Allison in the lead. At Nashville, Allison won the race while Petty finished 2nd, and the gap grew to 30 points. At the Southern 500 in Darlington, Allison won the race and Petty finished 3rd. And now, with only 7 races left in the season, Allison was on top by only 45 points. And this championship battle, for the first time since 1950, could go down to the final race. At Richmond, Petty won the race with Allison finishing 2nd, and the gap shrunk to 35 points. At Dover, Petty finished 2nd while Allison finished an abysmal 20th, and this would hand the points lead back to Richard Petty by 32 points with just 5 races to go. At Martinsville, the 2 drivers would finish 1 and 2 again with Petty on top, and the 2 would actually score the exact same amount of points, and the gap would remain at 32 points. At North Wilkesboro, the result would be the exact same, and the gap flatlined to 32 points with Petty on top. At Charlotte, Allison would bounce back with a huge win, and Petty only managed a 10th place finish, and Allison would take the point lead back by just 14 points with 2 races to go. At the penultimate race of the season at Rockingham, Allison would pull off another huge win while Petty finished 2nd, and going into the finale, the 2 drivers were only separated by 24 points. And for the first time in 22 years, we had a championship battle go down to the final race, and all Allison would have to do was finish 3rd if Petty gained max points. In the finale at the Texas World Speedway, Richard Petty was out in front almost all day, but he would inherit the powers of the postseason Dallas Cowboys and choke the win away and finish third, with Allison finishing right behind him in fourth. And with that, Bobby Allison would take down Richard Petty and walk away the champion of 1972. So, we had what has to be the greatest championship battle in history up to this point. Bobby Allison and Richard Petty were so close this season, and that made for one of the greatest championship battles ever. These two were so even in the stat sheet, but what ultimately gave Allison the edge was 2 more wins and 1 less DNFs. And despite the 2 drivers finishing 1-2 13 times throughout the season, and Petty winning the 1-2 battle 8-5, Allison's 2 more wins are what ultimately won Allison the championship, and would be the first time since 1963 that we had a different champion from real life. Well, anyway, that'll do it for today, guys. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week for 1973.